Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. People are still streaming in, but I don't want to waste anyone's time. And thank you all for coming. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and I'm delighted to actually be sort of in person. We're at New York University Wagner School of Public Service, and some of us are in the room, and the rest of you are online. Thank you for joining from wherever you have joined. Just a couple of notes before we begin. If you haven't signed up for the New York Southeast Asian Network newsletter, we've started again, and please do, because there's lots of interesting things coming up, including this Thursday, if I'm correct. Alan Hicken is going to be giving a New York Southeast Asian Network sponsored talk along with various partners on Thai politics. And then on the 22nd of September, we will be having the author of Opposing Power, Elvin, in conversation with Meredith Weiss, also a New York Southeast Asian Network event. But now we're going to get started on a very important talk that we're very lucky we can even hold today. We've all been wondering, how can Myanmar suffer more than it's already suffered in the last year since the February 1st, 2021 coup? Thousands have been killed, imprisoned, tortured, and more than 1.3 million people are displaced. The conflict continues, the economy is tanked, the baht has collapsed, there's soaring inflation, COVID runs amok, there's draconian financial controls and dwindling foreign reserves. And we are very, very lucky that none other than Gwen Robinson is in New York today to give us her view, mapping out this escalating catastrophe and laying out some possible ways forward. Gwen is editor-at-large for Nikkei Asia and a senior fellow at ISIS Thailand at Chulalongkorn University. The timing of this talk is very important because the General Assembly will be meeting. The UN General Assembly meets every September. And this year, it evolved down the road last year, but this year they're going to have to choose whether or not the current ambassador under the NLD-led government, Ambassador John Moon, will be given the credentials to continue as the ambassador to the UN. But also that decision is just a little window on the larger and never-ending struggle between the junta and the resistance. And there is the junta on the one side, led by none other than the notorious Myung Leung, and the resistance, which is a complicated, and Gwen's going to help us unravel who is the resistance and what's going on. So I wanted to start, and thank you so much for coming, Gwen.
Thanks.
With the UN and the credential issue.
Right, yeah, well, indeed, and thanks a lot for having me today, and to all involved in setting this up. It was quite timely to be here right now, and as you say, the credential issue is just the, it kind of crystallizes this whole growing debate about the position of the NUG, the National Unity Government. At its core is the NLD, the National League for Democracy, which was leading the administration that was ousted, as we all know, by the coup last year. So I think the credential issue has so much broader significance, but what it really has galvanized is this debate about control, territorial control, the NUG's claim to legitimacy to represent Myanmar, to be the rightful government of Myanmar. This is very difficult as it's a, it calls itself a parallel administration, but increasingly that we've seen remarkable achievements, I think, despite a lot of criticism, and this is Burma, there's a lot of criticism all the time and debate, but we've seen the beginning, the real unfolding of some key aspects of a kind of shadow administration, really, some underground education, universities, schools, online, so-called CDM, civil disobedience movement, teachers, staffing those, the health system. There's a lot of CDM doctors out there right through Myanmar, often in conflict areas, providing healthcare services. So there's sort of elements of an administration coming together. And I think the really key, the linchpin to everything is acceptance of the NUG and legitimacy in the eyes of the world. And I think this is why we're seeing unprecedented momentum since February 1 coup last year of claims about territorial control, about how much sway and legitimacy the NUG has. So I think that's the kind of surrounding of this debate in the UN.
Do you think if the General Assembly doesn't accept the credentials of the ambassador, that this would be a fatal flaw to the NUG, or what do you think the stakes are?
No, I don't think it would be fatal, but I think the workings are quite arcane for the UN and credentialing with a credential committee that does include China and Russia, two of the biggest backers of the junta, as well as the US, and then some other members that change yearly. Those three big ones are permanent members. So I think there is also no direct veto power. If members of that committee object, then it has to go to a vote in the General Assembly, which means we all know where that will go. We've seen a couple of votes on Myanmar, and this is separate from the Security Council, where China and Russia always ensure that there will be no really extreme decision on Myanmar. But I think that whole process, I won't say virtually guarantees, but I think pretty well we will see Ambassador Chomortuan still in position. And I think there's a quiet agreement that he doesn't grandstand and take big positions or make proposals, but you can see how much it drives the junta crazy, because every time, even votes on Ukraine, you've got Myanmar voting along with the great and good, and this is not what suits the junta at all. And we all know that last year there was an assassination attempt on Chomortuan. I don't think any of us would put it past the junta to, so that shows that I think his role is quite critical. Of course, the NUG and the resistance can survive without that UN representation, but for now, I think it's invaluable. And this next phase, I see this coming year kicking off with this UN General Assembly endorsement, I hope, of the ambassador. But I think this next phase will really be the critical one to enable the NUG to gain legitimacy if it plays its cards right.
So on that, to move from the UN and the international down to the ground, give us a sense of what is going on right now on the ground in terms of resistance versus the army.
Right, that's a great and really difficult question, but I'll just point out that I wear a couple of hats, including a sort of academic research and also as a journalist based in Thailand. So some of my insights are from on the ground research, including a lot of interviews with resistance forces, which, let's just say, move in and around and across borders, and as well elements of the resistance, the NUG, the overarching umbrella body, the NUCC, the National Unity Consultative Council. So the NUG actually works like a bit of an engine for the NUCC, which is really the most extraordinary microcosm of Myanmar's, Myanmar society that we've seen, I think, probably since Burma gained independence from Britain. I've never seen such a diverse group. So there's representatives of NUCC, NUG. Let's get into the alphabet soup here. We've got CRPH, which is the parliamentarians who were ousted by the coup, and then EAOs or EROs, as they call themselves, ethnic armed organizations or ethnic revolutionary organizations, and a number of other players. I won't go on. What's the picture? There's been a big claim in the recent days by particularly a big report by the Special Advisory Council on Myanmar, which is a committee or a body of experts, including Yang He Lee, the former human rights rapporteur on Myanmar, and others who put together a lot of research to come up with some pretty interesting figures. The report claimed 52% of territory is controlled by the resistance. And they had other figures like also that the military can only outrightly control 17% and the rest is in contention. Now, there are similar claims being made, particularly in the lead up to the General Assembly. Everyone sees this as a real moment to push as much as possible the NUG's right to be seen as the legitimate government of Myanmar. I don't want to be a spoiler, but I think at this point, claiming the 52% of territory, that doesn't really figure or include major towns or cities. We're talking about a lot of territory, and we know that central Myanmar, the central Burma-dominated areas, Sagaing and Magway, other areas are absolutely, sort of almost 100% controlled in some pockets by the resistance. At the same time, we're seeing ferocious fighting, and I think a key moment. I wouldn't be surprised if fairly soon, given the progress that has been made by resistance forces, that we will see a whole town fall. But as we all know, you can control a whole country by controlling the capital, the state apparatus, the funds, the bureaucracy that hasn't gone CDM. So I think that's still a big question. But there has been a really important shift in perception, I think, in the last few months, that the resistance is prevailing. It hasn't gone away. We saw this before in 1988 with a savage coup where we saw people massacred in the streets, and the same thing happened. Memories are short. Students fled Yangon, went to the border, formed a resistance force, the ABSDF. The country was in turmoil. What happened? It faded. Spirit was broken. We saw a succession of fairly brutal, repressive juntas that ruled the country with an iron fist and took the country backwards into the Stone Age. And this time, of course, this resistance is not going to let that happen. And I've been really, even me, close up on the ground, amazed at the resilience of these forces. So I think you've got that. And you've also got, we can go into things like the economy. The junta cannot control the whole economy, that's clear. And particularly in pockets of resistance, and maybe I shouldn't say pockets, it's wide swathes of resistance. We've got states, Eastern Myanmar, Karen, Cayenne, and Kayam, which is Karenni, as well as Central Myanmar, even Rakhine, which has got its own dynamic going. But increasingly, there is a lot of shift. And in those areas, the economy is also not controlled by the junta. So you've got this very uneven mix. And I would say it's almost impossible for anyone to claim that there is this percent of control by either side. But what is clear is that 19 months going into the 20th month after the coup, the State Administration Council of Min Aung Hlaing cannot claim to control this country. And in anyone's books, I would say that if you can't control a country 20 months after you've taken it over, you're failing.
So on that, tell us a bit what you know about what's going on with the military. We always read about defections. Is it continuing? Is the military strong? Is it unbeatable? Will it continue in a stalemate? What's your thoughts about the strength of the military? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. I think, there's a lot of wishful thinking here as well. So there's a very extremely active social media presence of a group of defectors. Actually, there's multiple groups now. They're attracting a lot of attention and I think support from sympathisers. And, figures are given, 10,000, nearly 10,000 perhaps military defectors, double that for police. And there's every sign of deteriorating morale in the military. At the same time, I think everyone who's watching this is obviously interested in Myanmar. You've seen the shocking savagery and violence in all the states where there's conflict and many thousands locked up. So it's very difficult to assess, but I think what we've got is a proliferation of these so-called PDFs, People's Defence Forces. Different numbers quoted there. The Special Advisory Council of Myanmar's report claimed quoted this NUG saying 660 such groups 150,000 fighters on the PDF side. You've got ethnic armed organizations, and very few of, I mean, Myanmar has more ethnic armed organizations than I think any other country in the world. There's probably 16 major ones. There's a lot of other splinter ones, but you've got the big ones are all basically anti-junta and engaging in conflict as we speak. So there's also another whole section of land defense forces, which are basically kind of like people's defense forces, but outside of the control of the NUG. So this is it adds up to rather a difficult picture to assess, but I think what is clear now is an increasing dynamic of cooperation where you're getting 20 PDF groups in one go attacking together military units. And before the operations were very amateur, I've interviewed a lot of these PDFs. A lot of them are kids from Yangon, university students, doctors, waiters, all kinds of people. And none of them had military training, but 1 year and a half onwards, I think they've got some extraordinary momentum up. So I'd say that we can say it's a mix.
I want to go back to that because the violence becomes complicated of how the outside world views it. Before we go there, on this question of 20 months on, how would you assess how the NUG has created a sense of inclusion? Because the biggest problem from the beginning is that so many of the minority groups saw the NUG as a continuation of the NLD that didn't pay enough attention to them and didn't ever include them in the political dispensation of the opening. So how is that going now? What is the sense of cohesion and inclusion?
Right. That, again, is a diabolically difficult question. But I think the greatest triumph of the resistance has been staying together as it is. So anyone who's looked at Myanmar, even peripherally, you'll see the incredible diversity of interests, but particularly this whole, as you say, I think one of the biggest divides and issues has been the ethnic groups, and they're waging their own wars and their own interests, struggling often for autonomy, a couple of them for secession. And it's been going on for decades. The Karen National Union, probably one of the, I think, most influential in this whole post-coup scenario, has been fighting a war for many decades. So are they included? I think the KNU and some of the bigger groups have emerged as real leaders in the whole sort of broader coalition.
The KNU is the Kachin.
Sorry,
Karen. Thank you.
And then you've got Kachina, also very influential. So the dynamic is really interesting now because what has been happening very quietly, I think, in the last, particularly the last few months, is a lot of consultation that is really picking up momentum between the various groups. There's desperate efforts within the NUG, which is led by the NLD, is very aware of this need for inclusion. And right now, I think what has happened is most of the key players are rising above some of these deep internal issues. There's a history of resentment, of exclusion, ethnic groups, and also other minority groups. And we're not even getting to the Rohingya situation. But, the NUG took a huge step to a point, not quite, can't bring themselves to quite give them a cabinet position. But we've got a Rohingya representative at the NUG, extremely articulate. And I think it's really clear that there is a determination to leave the difficult issues until later. What is the most difficult issue is that there are still a lot of the resistance include the ousted administration, ousted lawmakers, or with the NLD. A lot of them really feel that they are fighting to restore their rightful role. They were elected democratically in November 2020, and now they see that they are fighting to regain that position. But given this extraordinary sweeping nature of the resistance now, you can easily see that it's hard for me to say the majority, but a lot of the younger people that are out there fighting are fighting as a revolution. They see it as wiping away all the previous structures. They've abrogated the 2008 constitution. So they're not even bound by a constitution under which this NLD was elected. So I think everyone knows without acknowledging that that is going to be a big issue down the track. And what is fantastic right now, I think, from the opposition viewpoint, I mean, not opposition, resistance viewpoint, is that people can put those differences aside right now. They are now drawing up an interim charter. And I think that charter, or the debate about that and the consultations that are going on right now, like incredible shuttling back and forth, constant Zooms, as anyone knows who's dealt with Myanmar. They're all living on Zoom these days, but there's a lot of also physical contact around the world. And I think that semblance of unity is not only surviving, but it's being shored up because I think everyone is galvanized on this, new phase.
I hope someone asks what that's going to look like when they do finally address it, but we've got other things to. I want to talk about the economy for a minute. How are they affording the fighting? And how are people living in the cities? How are people farmers? I mean, what is going on to people to feed themselves and to continue fighting?
That's an excellent point. And as you summed up so neatly at the beginning, I mean, I think you threw in all those facts together. Incredible. I mean, I think all the gains of the last 10 years have been wiped out. And I think the UN figures are that the number of people below the poverty line has doubled in just 20 months to, I think it's about half the population now, nearly just 46% of the population. Myanmar has 55 million people according to the census. So, when you've got half a country living in poverty, and just 20 months ago, it was only 25%, which wasn't great anyway, but at least the NLD administration was addressing that. But I think the bigger issue about the collapse of the economy is total mismanagement, motivated by this need for control by the junta. So you've seen the near collapse of banking with ridiculous controls coming on, which is in turn driving business out. So big businesses, I think we've all read about some of the big ones, but at least 30 of the biggest top investors who are of Western or Japanese or others have exited Myanmar. There's very few big Western investors left in Myanmar. I think the smaller ones now are also starting to give up because of very harsh foreign exchange controls, and the collapse of the currency is extraordinary. It's now down. There's been a big surge recently, so it's now down by more than 2/3 of its value, with a heavy control on an exchange rate, official exchange rate, and forcing people who do earn dollars to exchange forcibly within a very short time at them, effectively handing the junta a lot of money to buy dollars, having to exchange at a very short rate. And the other thing I think people have heard about is, and it's happening all over the world as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the oil prices are through the roof. Myanmar produces a lot of gas, but doesn't produce a lot of oil. So I think what sums it all up is the economic forecast figures. We saw the World Bank say last year, as a result of the coup, the economy contracted by minus 18%, which is huge for an economy. This year, the World Bank predicted 3% growth, which I think was way too optimistic, particularly considering what we're watching now. But I think the more reliable one is a minus 5.5% growth forecast from Fitch. And that would really show that this economy is really imploding. However, can I just say, sorry, I'm talking too much, but can I say that don't forget the Russia and China factor. So Russia, as we know, always happy to see an opportunity, has moved in big time, shored up very cozy relations with the junta, is now shipping military hardware, and now we've seen a cozy deal to supply oil and petroleum products through a joint venture chaired, or at least driven by Min Aung Hlaing, the junta chief's son, and as well, we've got China busily in there, came over, just recently held a big meeting in Myanmar, in Bagan, of the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Forum, and through that, China is providing the junta, or rather Myanmar, a lot of infrastructure and support. There's investment coming in very steadily from the Russians and the Chinese, and of course, we no doubt will see other investments from other countries that are not too fussed about, you know, people being killed and tortured and other things, as long as they
So
make
this
money.
stalemate could sort of just stay going on? What do you think? What's
Yeah.
the trigger to see something different?
Well, I think, you know, I started covering Myanmar very closely from 2010, and even then that was at the tail end of these really bleak years, and we saw what happened after 1988 and the closing down of Myanmar then. And I saw that, you know, people make do, right? The country lurches along, and in some ways, I mean, we talk about an imploding economy. It won't totally implode. What we'll see is the crony culture come back, and fueled by also more investments from these other countries. And I think, as we pointed out, a lot of people are likely to live in abject poverty. I think many will be close to starvation, but I think the country could lurch on indefinitely. It's not like this will bring down the junta, but what could conceivably bring them down is a combination of much more sustained fight back from the resistance forces militarily. Sanctions have not really worked so far, but we're just seeing, I think, the lag effect of a lot of actions being taken. Of course, there's a lot of pressure now on the US to sanction. The biggest cash cow for the junta is MOGI, the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which controls all the lucrative offshore gas concessions. And there's an intense debate now in Washington about whether to go ahead and sanction MOGI. It's really hard to tell if they'll go ahead. If they do sanction all the gas business of Myanmar, I think that could see the economy go to yet another low. The junta is desperate for foreign exchange and can't pay a lot of its bills. But as I said, this all will come back again to Russia and how much it's prepared to step in. And already the Russian oil companies are in there trying to sew up a deal, and possibly rush in where, let's not forget, Chevron, the US oil and gas major, which announced that it was going to withdraw because it couldn't tolerate human rights abuses and all that before, has slightly backed away from that and is still in there, hasn't withdrawn. So I think that's also something that would really deal another blow to the economy, but drive the junta even further into the arms.
So trying to imagine this mosaic, how does the resistance and the NUG imagine they can break through this stalemate?
Yeah, sorry, you asked about the funding of how is the resistance funding itself. I think, again, I presume I'm talking to people who understand or have followed this, but there is tremendous goodwill and support for the resistance. I think there's a widespread view that, very few. I mean, Ukraine is horrific as well, but the kind of level of savagery and almost gratuitous cruelty that is being on display in Myanmar has earned a lot of sympathy. I think the NUG has a lot of support. I'd say there's a lot of funding also from expatriate communities abroad, and a lot of support for resistance groups. So there is support there. And you were saying, how does it all come together, military?
Well, there's, on the one hand, it's hard enough to imagine that the resistance and the NUG stay together, then to fight the military, then to figure out a way to get out of the stalemate. So there's a lot of complications and obstacles. So let's just stay for a minute. So you talked about that they have enough to continue, they have enough arms to continue the resistance, it seems.
Right.
But do they have enough political will to stay together and make a path forward and figure out a way to get international support, to get pressure from somebody to start moving the mechanics, the actual battleground of movement.
Yeah, well, that's another one of your finished questions, Margaret, but it actually, it does come back to this thing of it's just so much of a whole that it's difficult to separate because, the military thing actually does link to this issue of territorial control and therefore legitimacy. And legitimacy will come when the West, particularly the major countries, will recognise and support the NUG. And that's where it all comes round in a circle. I think you said about the resistance. Actually, I mean, it's striking to interview quite a few of these resistance fighters and realise that, a lot of them are in units of maybe 200, mainly men. There's women as well, but on average, from my interviews, you've got about 20% of units have guns, and a lot of them will take turns hanging back in a battle and then send fresh ones to the front line because they're sharing guns. In Chin State, you see them using old hunting rifles. I think that's very well known now. There's some extraordinary footage of some of these battles. I mean, but in the beginning, they were using slingshots. I mean, they've come a long way. The big game changer in all of this, if we're saying that territorial control is the bottom line, would be heavier weapons, because right now, I think this explains the savagery we're seeing now, which is a lot of aerial bombardment, whole villages being bombed, civilians being driven out of their homes, homes being torched, and people living. There are, we said, more than 1.3 million displaced. So why that's happening is that the military can no longer, in a lot of parts of Myanmar, drive along the road, send convoys. They're being attacked left, right, and centre by small arms like, IEDs, explosive devices, drones, drone technology, which they become the resistance has become very skillful at. And so as a result, you've got a lot of enclaves, particularly around the towns, of military holed up, and they send out helicopters or jets dropping bombs, almost randomly on villages. And whenever there's an attack by a PDF force, it might be just an ambush, the retribution is huge. I mean, they will go and destroy a village because some military is attacked. If there was even some anti-aircraft weaponry, I think that could change the whole game, because if you knocked out air power by the military, then that leaves them very little option in some of the states where they're actually hemmed in and they're relying increasingly on air power. I should also say the end of the rainy season. Myanmar's just gone through a very heavy rainy season, which has also impeded some of the military operations, but that's moving now.
So in about 5 minutes, I want to open the conversation to questions from our very distinguished audience, actually. So I hope some of you will think of questions and we would love to take them. But before that, you just mentioned the need for air power. Where would that come from? And that brings us to the international dimension. Ukraine has taken up such oxygen in the international world. Where does Myanmar fit in the big power fight? And would the US or Europe expend any political capital to help the resistance?
That is such a good question. But I think it's really important to understand, and I think most people do, the difference between, despite the level of the horrifying level of savagery and violence in Myanmar, it is a different situation when it comes to things like the question of, say, intervention or just turning around and pouring arms into Myanmar. Ukraine is a direct invasion, a direct hit on sovereignty. And Myanmar, as we know, technically this is an internal affair. And we haven't really talked about ASEAN, but sorry, Sydney, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which does make some people glaze over. But in this context, I think ASEAN is really important because this is in the heart of ASEAN. And I think it has been a convenient fig leaf, actually, for big powers like America and even the EU, Britain, which do say the right things, do the right things, are trying to support with aid, but will not go and send arms in the way the US has showered arms onto Ukraine. They won't do that yet. One of the arguments is financial support for the resistance in other forms, non-lethal, will free up the money that the resistance has in order to let them spend it on arms. The trouble is it's very difficult to go and buy heavy arms on the international market and then bring it into a country which, so this is a big problem. And I think that partly is a logistical problem, but I think overall it's a big political problem. There is a lot of pressure within ASEAN, which is, some people have predicted the end of ASEAN as a result of the division over Myanmar. And I don't think that's too dramatic. We'll see. The summit is coming up, the annual summit of leaders of ASEAN in November in Cambodia, and the baton will pass from Cambodia to Indonesia. And Indonesia is a much more active and, let's just say, clearly more sympathetic to the resistance cause in Myanmar than other countries, for example, like Vietnam and Laos. Vietnam, by the way, has some very lucrative ventures in Myanmar directly with the military, including in telecom. So I think there's a lot of hope still pinned on ASEAN. ASEAN has been poo-pooed and rubbished, and a lot of protest movements in Myanmar have even sort of gotten out there and burnt ASEAN flags. They're very upset about lack of support of ASEAN. ASEAN is between a rock and a hard place. They are risking blowing up their whole fragile, much prized unity, and they're driven by two central principles, as we know: centrality as in unanimity and non-interference in each other's affairs. I think we've seen that whole thing become a mockery over Myanmar. And Indonesia was very active in the Rohingya crisis in 2016 and 17, the mass expulsion of Rohingya in 2017 to Bangladesh. And the Foreign Minister, Retno Marsudi, was very active then. She's still there. And most of all, while they've been very quiet right now in the lead up to the change of chairmanship in ASEAN, it's very clear that Indonesia is very close to Malaysia, and the Malaysian foreign minister has basically been throwing all kinds of diplomatic bombs into ASEAN over Myanmar, and has put proposals on the table that I don't think the other ASEANs can really put away. He has proposed that Myanmar will be barred from all ministerial meetings of ASEAN until they conform with a 5-point plan that the leaders had discussed shortly after the coup. There's no chance that the junta would conform to that plan now, it's very clear. And he's also proposed a bunch of other things which are completely unacceptable to the junta and some members of ASEAN, including including engaging the NUG, which the junta has described as terrorists, and will not, which also has, I think, put some of the other ASEAN countries offside. The bottom line, I think, within ASEAN is Thailand. Thailand is the only ASEAN country to share a border with Myanmar, and that is one of the big keys to supply of the resistance of ethnic armed groups, that long border. And we've seen refugees spilling across that border in waves, especially when junta operations, the SAC troops get active. So I think Thailand lives in fear, on one hand, of being deluged with refugees. And you can imagine last year when the COVID paranoia was huge, they had visions of tidal waves of COVID-ridden refugees like pouring across the border. But I think at one point it got to about 10,000 refugees in just the space of a month. The big one hasn't happened like we saw in Cambodia in the 80s, which was massive. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of refugees coming in from Cambodia in the 80s. But I think those memories for Thailand are still very raw, and they don't want to see that. On the other hand, Thailand sees itself as a key anchor of ASEAN, a kind of leadership role. Their big concerns are balancing everyone. Only Thailand has equally good relations with China and the US, which, as we all know, is very hard to do. And they would like to keep that. They have very good relations, or they try, with the junta next door, Min Aung Hlaing. But at the same time, there seems to be a very quiet, blind eye policy, not actively helping Myanmar's resistance, but not, there's a lot of resistance figures that could be captured and handed back to the junta. That does not happen in Thailand, or has not so far. So I think the ASEAN dynamic of all things is very important, even though some people might roll their eyes about ASEAN.
Before I turn it to questions, and there's one coming up, is the Rohingya issue an important piece of the puzzle? And if so, tell us how.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, so we've got this extraordinary, weird thing that happened in the last couple of months, where Min Aung Hlaing, the junta chief, suddenly announced that they would like to begin repatriating Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh. As most of you probably know, there's more than I think upwards around 1 million refugees there now, mainly in Cox's Bazar, and some now being moved to an island off the coast of Bangladesh. That's just a small number. And this extraordinary sort of ploy by Min Aung Hlaing to say that they'd like to bring them back, which of course has flummoxed everyone. And then shortly after that, they admitted some Rohingya students to the university in Sitwe, the capital of Rakhine, which again, really, I mean, they're more interested in killing Rohingya than letting them have university education. This is all posturing because of the current ICJ case, genocide case at the ICJ brought by Gambia, International Court of Justice. There are other cases, including the ICC, but the ICJ case is the one that the junta particularly cares about because it's well underway. They made a play to get more control, be more involved in that case. And what does it show? It shows that there are still some things the junta cares about. It cares about staring down the challenges and the genocide charge. They are very agitated about that. So I think that kind of, it's all kabuki to offer to repatriate Rohingya, and I think it will enable them. Of course, the conditions aren't right. We've seen like a massive outbreak of fighting, by the way, between the Arakan army and the junta in Rakhine State around the border of Bangladesh. That's a different dynamic, but clearly it means that you are not going to get one Rohingya refugee going back across a border in conflict, and particularly with no real facilities prepared to receive them. But clearly Min Aung Hlaing is playing at that. The other issue they do care about, and can I just say, is, we saw with the arrest of the recent arrest of the former UK ambassador to Myanmar, Vicky Bowman, and her husband, the artist Tang Lin, that again, they care something about that case, made them want to make an example of her, and just to show how much they are in beyond comprehension. Vicky Bowman happened to be, as head of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, one of the last remaining advocates for Western companies to remain in Myanmar. She was a huge supporter of responsible investment, corporate governance standards, and I think with this arrest, the junta has really sort of shot itself in the foot, but for some reason, they wanted to make a statement. So they are still playing. No, they wanted to.
Yeah,
no, they wanted to send a signal
that nobody can touch them. That they're so powerful. Is that what
yes, but also there are clearly other things around it that they were irked, maybe by. Vicky was always very careful not to directly criticise the junta, but it was very clear. It was an implied criticism if you're trying to help companies be transparent, trying to help companies fight back against she was also very against the internet restrictions which are affecting companies. So I think that was making a statement. So they do care about, they want to send signals, they want to send signals to the diplomats. And most of all, I think this Chomotun case, the UN ambassador, is also one that they really care about. So there are still levers, but nothing seems to work in terms of any kind of gambit that would make them engage or even signal readiness to come to the negotiating table. And on the other hand, tragically, the NUG quite understandably does not want to negotiate with the junta. And we haven't talked about this, but we won't, running out of time. But I think the other thing Min Online really cares about is the elections next year. He's got a mad proposal to hold elections August 2023, trying to force, obviously some tame NLD who are maybe quite more centrist to put themselves forward as candidates. He'll have a sham election. This matters because he wants to then stand up and declare himself as a legitimately elected prime minister of a legitimate government. So I think that dynamic is at play, and that could be a lever because he so desperately wants legitimacy and credibility. But what you'd have to do to, I think, negotiate with that kind of is probably beyond the pale of almost anyone I can think of. Okay.
Gwen, you're amazing.
Okay.
We have some questions, but I think we all can say that this was quite the torture horizon. Thank you. But we have two questions. So I'm a huge fan of Gwen, aren't we all? Thank you as always for your fantastic analysis. My question is there any responsible way for foreign businesses to continue being engaged? We're just talking about this in Myanmar without dealing with Ramadan. That is, given that substantial swaths of Myanmar's territory are controlled by the resistance, or at least not controlled by the junta, are there ways outside doctors can support local actors can support local economies and small businesses without inadvertently benefiting military?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I look at business a lot, and it is very interesting. I've talked to a lot of business people, and they're even down to the small and medium company level. But it is very interesting that some Western governments are now, obviously just before the coup, there was vast amounts of aid money coming in, that a lot of it was going through counterpart agencies of the Myanmar government. Obviously, the US, EU, Japan, everyone suspended it afterwards. But that money has been redirected. I'm not saying all of it, but a lot of money has been going in through other channels, not just, separate from humanitarian aid. There are some very interesting programs to identify and support deserving, worthy companies. There's clearly, we haven't even gotten to this terrible situation for agriculture now, with farmers unable to even afford the fertilizer to grow crops. So I think there's huge scope for a lot of even small and medium-sized companies. And I have actually talked to Western investors who are still interested. It's not just to make a buck. I think it takes a rare kind of investor to want to get involved, but there are people who care about Myanmar, want to help with jobs or other things. So I think there is a way to, obviously there's a way. You don't have to involve with the junta, except the trouble is there is a raft of regulation and bureaucracy that's been introduced by them. And so you do have to deal with state apparatus. But I think that's a very good question, because I would say for anyone with nerves of steel and probably, sort of some commitment to Myanmar, I wouldn't just go in to try and make a buck like, obviously someone like Vladimir Putin is. But I think there is scope to invest and possibly, if you conduct yourself carefully, maybe avoid getting engaged with the military, and at the same time maybe help in agricultural development, things like that. I know some fantastic coffee growing projects and things like that. They are still managing to work. And I have other friends invested in avocado growing, other things.
So this next question is from Kayori Zume. The executions, those horrible executions earlier this year, ASEAN wasn't able to stop them. So the question is, the military oppression since then has only intensified, especially in Yangon. Do you think there is any key role from now on for ASEAN to cure, save any of the civilians under the oppression of the military?
So I presume that would mean what, civilians under arrest in prisons
I
and
guess
things like.
to stop more executions.
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't really discuss the execution issue in great detail. It was extremely upsetting, and it also that was a weird dual message sent by the junta on that. One was they wanted to show they didn't care and they could execute in cold blood. On the other hand, they cared enough to make a, to do it and make an issue. They wanted to send that message to the international community. Is there anything, I'm not quite clear whether you meant, to avoid
Further.
You're right to mention ASEAN. I mean, Hun Sen, that was his biggest humiliation, was writing an open letter to Min Aung Hlaing, or writing the letter and then releasing it, urging him to, or even pleading with him to halt the executions, and Min Aung Hlaing just went straight ahead. So I think in some ways that will rebound on him, because Hun Sen after that, that was it. That was the ultimate humiliation for Hun Sen. What would happen from now on? There's supposed to be at least 120 prisoners on death row, and we get sort of false alarms that, oh my God, they've been put into these special yellow suits and moved to an area where that means they're going to be hung imminently. So far, it hasn't happened according to reports. We just don't know half the time what is going on in those prisons. So I wouldn't say there's probably very little that can be done to halt further executions.
So we're going to take a question from Sydney Jones, who's actually in this room. So speak up, Sydney, and we'll pick you up on the mic.
Okay, we haven't discussed Buddhism so far in the discussion, and from 2012 onwards, it's clear that the military made a major effort to identify the Sangha and control the Sangha.
Yeah.
What do you see in terms of the Buddhist role in the resistance, and where the trajectory might lie in the nexus between the government, the resistance, and the Sangha?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Sydney. In fact, I watched the monks in 2007, and in earlier waves were much more active. This time, there have been pockets and some very brave monks, but on the whole, I think the perception also of people who really watch the Sangha is that they've, almost disappointment that a lot of them do not want to take the risk, or else, of course, you've got that extreme nationalist monks, the very ugly ones that were very anti-Muslim and were extremely active in Rohingya expulsion. At the moment, the linkage, and the other thing is Min Aung Hlaing, the junta has their favourite monks as well, and we saw some of the prominent ones taking more of a role. There was a horrific picture a few months ago of a monk vigilante group with monks, actually carrying machine guns. So I think that's extremely unusual, but on the whole, I haven't seen them play the kind of role one might have hoped, but we have also seen some terrible examples of monasteries being attacked and monks being imprisoned, and in fact some monks being tortured. So it's just something I can't predict right now, but still you can see that in even still the younger generation, there is still this deep faith in Buddhism, and so it's still serving as a kind of guiding, or maybe a bit of a comfort to the resistance. And those candlelit vigils that we're still seeing, I mean, there's still brave protesters out there, and I do see monks in that group. So
we're going to take a question from Leslie Miller. No questions are stupid. I visited Myanmar twice, most recently 4 or 5 years ago, and met a lot of ordinary people and stayed in beautiful hotels. Just wondering, if tourism is entirely finished, or if it still goes on? When Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest, for example, there were still people coming as tourists. And what must life be like for those ordinary people that I became fond of? Also, what might have happened to the great stupas of Bagan?
right.
I
Yes.
hear the caretakers are still trying to take care of it.
Yeah, indeed. So Bagan being one of the key sort of tourist destinations is lurching along. Believe it or not, there are hotels and resorts still open along the coast in particular, with some of those stunning beaches like Napoli and others. But as you point out, I mean, it is just tragic to see what was built up in the last 10 years with so many hopeful projects and beautiful hotels and great ideas in tourism. A lot of that has collapsed. I hate to say this, but again, you might see an invasion of Russian tourists. So far, the Chinese have been hemmed in by their own COVID restrictions. So I wouldn't say that tourism is completely dead, but we ran, in my role at Nikkei, we ran an extremely thoughtful piece a little while ago by Lorcan Lovett, one of our contributors, talking about this very thing about the ethical question of visiting Myanmar. On one hand, if you're a tourist and you go, you can feel you're maybe helping the local community. You're not like handing money directly to the junta. You can see the locals and go out and around. On the other hand, you feel, there's a lot of shaming of people who would consider being a tourist there. So I think it's, I'd say that the tourism industry will lurch on, but only those with enough funds to survive. And I do know various hotelier friends who are keeping their hotels open with occupancy of like 5 or 10%. Almost really, a lot of them are doing it to maintain support for their staff who've served them loyally and feel that. So that's also very tragic. I would say though, Leslie, don't worry, Bagan will survive. It's survived for centuries. And I think I'd like to think that we can all visit again in the future and it won't be destroyed, because at least we all know that even Min Online is in a deranged way, a very devout Buddhist. So I don't think you'd see them actually destroying ancient stupas and temples.
So we're going to take another question from in the room, from Anne-Marie Murphy.
Oh, right.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the military again. You talked about the numbers of desertions, and you talked about Min Online's desire for the election. Can you speak a little bit about the attitude of other senior generals?
Right.
Because I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of Indonesians. Obviously, Myanmar, as you noted, is top of their agenda for their ASEAN chairmanship. And all I heard was this group of generals is different. When we were working with the youth and others, there was an open-mindedness. There was a desire to see the country progress, not just focus on personal patronage, institutional interests. Is that your sense, or is there any breakaway within the kind of top echelon?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's like Kremlinology now. Yeah. Like we pore over the global, I've never read Global New Light of Myanmar more closely, which is, I tell you, it's really an excruciating read. But we're all looking for signs of cracks. There was a lot of excitement about the recent reshuffle where there were several key people in the junta moved and replaced. And there's a lot of speculation about, and in fact, a lot of the speculation about whether there's dissent in the junta, the upper level, is that some of the generals feel Min Online is not hardline enough. Now, that would be, so if that's the case, and there are a couple of names being speculated as, Min Online's game plan is to run in the sham election, declare himself a rightfully elected president, and handpick his successor. So there are successors being groomed. I won't go into it because it's too detailed, but I can assure you that a couple of the successors' names are extremely hardline generals. So I don't think even if Min Online died tonight, I don't think it's going to get any better. It could get a whole lot worse because there are some real nasties in there. On the other hand, you've got, as you said, there were more open-minded generals, particularly at the time of Myanmar's opening under President Thein Sein, who was himself, as you know, a very senior general, but some of those generals, like the defense minister of the junta now, Myat is, when I met him, was quite urbane, speaks English, had a smattering of French and other things, grew up overseas. He's now the defense minister presiding over these horrendous policies. So I don't think, and also, there's a lot of speculation about a possible counter coup. I think given the level of control and surveillance, even within the apparatus, it's going to be almost impossible. If there was a counter coup, there is the unthinkable that it would be by these hardline generals that don't want to take it even further. But I would say that I don't see any sign of reformers in there. And even if there are, I think we have to accept the fact things have gone too far in Myanmar. There's no way back. The military is totally tainted. I don't even want to get to the post, if there is a transition, if resistance forces got anywhere, I'm sure Sydney would have a lot of thoughts about having gone through Indonesia and seen the military go back to the barracks. What would you do with this bloodstained military? I mean, and plus the Myanmar military, even at a conservative estimate of numbers. So let's say, people have estimated 500,000. I think it's more like, and according to people like Tony Davis, a big expert on Myanmar military, we're talking about 200 to 250,000 personnel. But even then, some hope has risen in the last few weeks because of there was a leaked speech by Min Online just very recently, where unprecedented. I've never seen him admit there are some very big difficulties with the campaign. I've never seen that. That is, it's not 100% authenticated, but it seems quite authentic, that transcript of that speech. And in addition, there have been some big conflicts inside where a whole unit defected recently, mutinied and refused to follow the orders of the commander. Many other defectors who are debriefed talk about, there's been some particularly illuminating ones recently where it's extraordinary the tales that these soldiers tell of having to go with no food, carry around huge boxes of ammunition, be sent into almost certain, well, not certain death, but definitely very risky situations. And I think quite a few of them have had enough. And the key, I think what's really going on that we can't get verification is a lot of desertion. So these are people, they can't quite bring themselves to defect. So defectors, I think, is a misnomer because the defectors are actually quite a minority. But I think there is actually guys who wake up one day and think, I can't do this anymore. And they run away. They've all got families with maybe a farm or something. So I think there's a lot of that, but you will never get those numbers. But the defectors do say that battalions are now so under strength, it's a joke. A battalion, forgotten the number, but they're at sort of 50% or less.
So there's two more questions. One is about the military, and I'm going to go to that one, and then one on humanitarian assistance. This is also from Leslie Miller. The military, she says, live in their own villages and cut themselves off from the ongoing original tribal groups, such as in Shan, for example, and therefore feel no empathy for ordinary people. Is that correct?
Well, I think that's hard because, the whole Myanmar military known as the Tatmadaw or Sitat on a more derogatory term, have been sort of honed as a Burma-dominated group. So there are very few, there's almost no ethnic officers that get to any sort of, high level. And so when you say they live in their own villages, a lot of them are forced to live on base. I've interviewed defectors who got married, got sent off to somewhere like Kachin and never saw their wife for 3 years or once a year. And there's a lot of those sort that are forced to live on bases, or if they have their family with them, they're virtual prisoners. As you say, they are cut off from the broader community. Whether they have no empathy or sympathy, I think it depends. I mean, we saw that horrendous. There was a extraordinary footage from Radio Free Asia. Got hold of mobile phones of a phone of a military officer or soldier, I think, and they just been through villages in Sagaing, I think it was, and boasting and bragging and laughing about cutting throats and torturing and killing people and sort of, oh, that's 8 is nothing. I did 16. That sort of horrendous behavior and laughing. And I think that did a lot of damage, because I've interviewed a lot of defectors who, I mean, you know, actually I felt sympathetic for defectors who have risked everything, defected very early in the thing, talk about their disillusionment, thought they had signed up to, you know, serve a cause of protecting the people. So I think it takes all sorts, and I wouldn't say that they're all cut off from people and not sympathetic at all. And don't forget, every military man has mother, father, aunts, uncles, nieces. So, you know, a lot of them do have some connection to ordinary people.
So this is from Alexander, and I'm sorry, my eyes are so bad, I can't read your last name. Do you have any insight or comments into efforts at scaling up much needed humanitarian assistance via cross-border channels in Thailand?
Right.
There are networks in place, but some reluctance from both major donors and the Thai government.
Yeah, you're quite right. And that's why I touched on this issue of the Thai border. It's very sensitive, but obviously if you were going to get in aid that didn't have to go through, right now, any organization that wants to do, even like hand out blankets in Myanmar, you have to make an arrangement with a junta-controlled agency, counterpart agency. You can fund through UN agencies, but those UN agencies are also having to liaise with the state. If you want to get aid in that doesn't go through the military, you either have to sneak it in, go through ethnic armed groups, or maybe sneak it across borders. There's also a shared border with India. China, I don't think there's any humanitarian aid going in apart from to maybe ethnic armed groups. But there are, as you say, networks in place. And there's also an informal network of money transfers. And I think absolutely the best way for to get some sort of help into Myanmar is not sending blankets and bags of rice. It's to just get money through the informal Hundi network system, which is still working. And I think some money is getting through. And there's been some very good research done by Progressive Voice, for example, which does some great reports. Last week, they released a report about the humanitarian aid options in this terrible environment of control and surveillance, particularly in central Myanmar. And that recommendation was to go through local NGOs. But, you know, everything is a risk now in junta-controlled Myanmar. The surveillance is getting stronger and stronger. Facial recognition technology is coming in, surveillance of communication systems. So I think, as you say, that the only way to get to certain people, like including vast numbers of displaced, is through these local grassroots agencies. But getting to them is the problem, and I think the cash transfer option is possibly the most effective.
We have an anonymous question. How divided are families, and how divided is the society? Is it likely that people in the military have relatives in the
Well, yeah, I just touched on that. Most definitely. I've interviewed a lot of like PDF fighters, but also a lot of just CDM people, you know, civil disobedience people and others in hiding on the border or gone to other countries or even inside. And yes, they're all, I mean, there's a lot of big families in there, and I think that would happen. So in other sort of, you know, not quite comparable, but similar situations where you'd have, I mean, it's happening in America, right? You've got families of Trump supporters and Democrats all in one family. So yeah, definitely. And there's quite a few, the defectors, I've interviewed quite a few military defectors, and how do they get out? How do they get across the border? They've got connections. Most of them have some cousins, some nephews, some niece. Some of them have nephews in the resistance, but there's all kinds of networks and anyone who's ever dealt with Burmese know that there's an incredible sort of, grapevine and information that passes everywhere. And a lot of the defectors are getting out through those channels. So I would say that families are extremely divided, and also that, I don't know if you saw it, extraordinary phenomenon where a lot of parents have been taking out advertisements in Myanmar media, disowning their children as a measure of protection, saying, actually advertising, saying, I, Gwen Robinson no longer recognise my son, his name, because they've run off to join the resistance. And this is an effort to save their own families, not just themselves, but all the family. We've seen families really abused or even arrested because their relatives or their sons run off to join the resistance. So I think that's a lot of guilt and concern also for the PDF fighters who do run off. I mean, every one of them I've spoken to talks about family, and a lot of the ones on the front line are often either orphans or from broken homes and don't have, mum and dad and granny to worry about. But I think that's a really big issue.
So we did perfect timing, Gwen. Thank you all for joining us online and in the room. And I think we all can say that it was an extraordinary hour and 15 minutes, Gwen. I learned a great deal. Your knowledge is quite impressive and delivered beautifully and heartfelt.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Well, I really appreciate the moderation and the really diabolical questions. Thanks a lot.
So for those of us in the room, we can clap.